The first thing the record gives us is a date, and it is an unassuming one. October 3rd, 1885, in Breathitt County, Kentucky. The census of that year marked the town as nothing. Remarkable, a scattering of timber houses along a dirt road. A modest church bell that summoned the valley 3 times a week, and a mill whose wheel turned sluggishly whenever the river fell low. Yet amid such ordinary surroundings, a single object emerged that would trouble families, confound scholars, and eventually be locked away. A child's drawing, made in charcoal on a torn page of a school primer. It was not of his house, nor the church, nor even the mountains he woke to each morning. Instead, the boy had filled the page with a place that none of his neighbors had seen, a riverside dock with barges tied neatly along its edge, drawn with a precision that suggested not imagination, but memory. The contrast was unsettling from the start. Children were expected to doodle animals, to copy Bible verses, to sketch the familiar hills, not to lay down the angled roofs of warehouses, or to shade the waterline of a river he had never stood beside. Those who handled the paper said the drawing felt wrong, not because of the craft, but because it belonged elsewhere, as though the boy's hand had carried knowledge from a distance he could not have traveled. What made it worse was the certainty in his manner. He had no hesitation, no pauses where one expects a child to erase or redraw. His lines were steady, confident, laid as if the image had already existed in his mind, whole and waiting. It is here that our account begins, with the uncomfortable marriage of innocence and dread. A 9-year-old boy, his fingertips blackened by coal dust, produces an image that points beyond his small life. An image he could not have reasonably conjured. Witnesses recalled a silence after the page was passed around the classroom, broken only when the teacher folded it quickly and tucked it into her Bible. That act, one of concealment rather than celebration, marks the first moment when this story turned from curiosity to unease. What was intended as a child's pastime became the first verifiable cartographic anomaly credited to a miner in Kentucky's county records. We should be clear, what follows in these pages and testimonies comes not from rumor alone, but from the surviving fragments of official ledgers, family letters, and field notes by a physician sent to investigate. Some of these records were sealed for decades. Others surfaced only when archives were digitized. Together, they paint a portrait not of supernatural spectacle, but of a community at war with itself over how to interpret the unexplainable. That tension, the hunger for proof against the instinct to bury what cannot be explained, is the thread that binds this entire narrative. It is also the reason we begin not with tragedy or confession, but with a boy's drawing, innocent in its form, yet ominous in its accuracy, and destined to outlive him. Before moving further into the child's strange gift, it is necessary to pause and offer clarity about what this record contains, and the way in which it will be presented. What you will hear in the following account is reconstructed from official documents, family testimony, and fragments of reports preserved in county and state archives. Some details are dramatized in order to bridge gaps in the historical record, but none are invented for spectacle. That distinction matters because what follows touches on the suffering of children, the negligence of institutions, and the fear-driven decisions of a community. It is not entertainment, though it may be compelling. It is a reconstruction of events that left behind more questions than answers. A content warning must therefore be placed here at the very threshold. Listeners should be aware that this case involves a child who will ultimately come to harm, and that community panic and bureaucratic ambition play roles in what happened to him. There will be descriptions of illness, of loss, and of the way a boy's abilities were treated as both gift and curse. Nothing graphic will be included. There will be no need for lurid detail, but the emotional weight is unavoidable. If at any point the material feels overwhelming, consider stepping back. With that established, it is also important to acknowledge the tension at the heart of such a warning. On the one hand, transparency, naming the shadows before entering them, respects both the subject and the listener. On the other hand, the events themselves were shrouded in secrecy for decades. County officials chose to conceal files. Medical journals struck passages from reports, and even the boy's own family burned some of his sketches rather than risk their discovery. Transparency versus secrecy is the defining contrast of this section. We, standing at more than a century's distance, can afford to look directly at what they felt compelled to hide. This moment, then, functions as both threshold and invitation. The narrative you are about to follow asks you to weigh what was seen, what was recorded, and what was deliberately suppressed. And before we cross into the detailed chronology, I extend a simple gatekeeping prompt, the sort often used to measure the reach of a community that gathers around such stories. Where are you listening from tonight? A valley not unlike Breathitt's, a city that Elias Turner could never have imagined, or perhaps somewhere far beyond the banks of any Kentucky river. Breathitt County in 1885 was a place suspended between eras, a frontier spirit still clinging to the hills even as the slow march of industrial ambition pressed in from the larger towns of Louisville and Lexington. The land itself was steep, cut through with streams that flashed with sudden rains, and cloaked in dense forests of oak and hickory. Roads were little more than rutted tracks, choked with mud when the river rose, and dust when the sun baked for weeks. For most who lived there, life was not about progress, but about survival. Cornfields, hogs, timber hauled downstream, and coal dug from shallow seams with tools passed down across generations. Against this backdrop of toil and isolation, a boy's peculiar gift of drawing the unseen stood out like fire in dry grass. Religion was the first and last resort for the people of Breathitt. Families carried well-thumbed Bibles. Verses were recited as both comfort and warning, and sermons thundered against sin while whispering of redemption. The church, raised by communal hands, was the only structure in town built with squared beams and paint, a symbol of permanence. In a county where cabins sagged and barns collapsed beneath the weight of seasons, it was here that people sought sanctuary, their hope for stability against the threats of hunger, flood, or fever. Yet faith was matched and sometimes undermined by a deep suspicion of outsiders, of change, and of anything that strayed beyond the narrow circle of the familiar. This was also the year when itinerant men of science began pressing into Kentucky's more remote corners. Cartographers, surveyors, and physicians traveled with folded maps, brass instruments, and government commissions. They brought the promise of modern knowledge, but also a quiet arrogance that clashed with the county's fierce self-reliance. To the valley folk, such men were both help and harm. They promised progress, yet carried disruption, treating the land and its people as problems to be studied rather than communities to be understood. In this tension, sanctuary versus laboratory, the story of Elias Turner would become trapped. The physical geography mattered too. The Kentucky River bent in long loops that cut the county nearly in half, a lifeline and a barrier both. It delivered goods to market but also carried rumors, spreading word of coal seams, quarrels, and occasionally the kind of scandal that could ruin a family. When Elias's first drawing surfaced, whispers rode along that river faster than wagons on the ridges. Within weeks, families on distant farms were repeating the tale of a child who drew a place he had never seen, the story growing as it traveled, twisted by both wonder and dread. Daily life in the county carried on, but in the background, something was shifting. For a town that defined itself through what was familiar, kin, church, field, mine, the existence of a boy who sketched the unfamiliar threatened to unmoor them. It touched not only on questions of faith, but on the very boundaries of belonging. Was Elias a blessing meant to guide, or an omen meant to warn? Was he a vessel of God, or a dangerous curiosity for men of science to dissect? The fact that these questions arose at all reveals the precariousness of the place, a community proud of its sanctuary, yet constantly aware that the wider world was drawing nearer, pressing against its fragile borders. Elias Turner was 9 years old in the autumn of 1885, a child whose presence would have been unremarkable if not for the drawings. He was slight for his age, thin to the point of fragility, with a pale complexion that marked him as a boy often kept indoors by illness. His father, a mill hand with calloused palms and soot-blackened nails, could not hide his disappointment in a son who lacked the sturdiness needed for field or timber work. His mother, however, kept a protective hand over him, insisting that his weakness of body was balanced by a sharpness of mind. Elias spent hours in silence, sitting on a rough wooden stool near the fire, his hands smudged with charcoal, his eyes narrowed as though he were staring not at the paper, but through it, pulling something from beyond. At school, Elias seemed ordinary until a slate or sheet of paper was placed before him, while other children scratched their names in uneven letters or sketched crude stick figures. Elias drew with calm precision, barns with beams aligned, river currents traced with subtle shading, windows set in proportion that suggested he understood perspective without ever being taught. His teacher, Miss Hannah Reeves, recognized the strangeness early. She described his work in a journal entry that would later be preserved in county records. The boy sets his hand to the page and seems to recall rather than invent. It is as though he copies from memory, but of what I cannot say. Innocence and unwanted notoriety met in Elias with uncomfortable force. He had no boastfulness about his skill. When praised, he simply lowered his eyes as if embarrassed to have been noticed. Yet the very accuracy of his images made him the object of gossip. Children teased him, calling him old eyes or now witch hand, repeating whispers, overheard from their parents. For a boy who had done nothing but draw what came to him, the attention felt like punishment. Still, he continued, compelled by something he could not resist. The first artifact tied to Elias survives not in the form of rumor, but in a physical fragment, a page from his school primer, kept between psalms in Miss Reeves's Bible until her death. The page is browned now, the edges brittle, but the sketch upon it is unmistakable. Rows of buildings with pitched roofs, a dock lined with timbers, and barges whose rigging is drawn with surprising fidelity. What unsettled later examiners was not only the detail, but the placement. The boy had included the compass rose in the corner, north arrow pointing exactly as it would be on official survey maps. He had no compass, no training, and no reason to include it. The drawing stands as an early testament that Elias's images were not idle fancies but deliberate, structured renderings of actual places. Neighbors who first saw the drawing reacted with unease. A few admired it and urged Miss Reeves to send the boy to Lexington, where his skill might find an audience. Others muttered that such accuracy was unnatural, that children should draw sheep and hills, not towns beyond their sight. His father dismissed it at first, grumbling that sketching would never put food on the table, but his mother folded the page gently, as though it were fragile glass, and hid it away from curious hands. She seemed to understand, in a way she could not put into words, that the drawings were both gift and burden, that they would invite attention the family might not survive. This moment, when Elias was still a child among children, marks the threshold where curiosity began to curdle into suspicion. He had revealed nothing more than what his hand demanded he reveal. Yet the mere act of bringing forth unseen places placed him at odds with the rhythms of his community. What others saw as play or study, Breathitt County began to interpret as omen. The primer page, passed from hand to hand before being locked away, remains the first surviving evidence of a boy whose art would eventually pull him, and those around him, into a widening circle of fear. The first true incident that forced the county to take notice occurred late in October of 1885. Scarcely a fortnight after, Elias's primer sketch was tucked into Miss Reeves's Bible. It began, as so many rural stories did, with a gathering at the churchyard. The children had been dismissed early that day, and Elias, clutching another sheet of rough paper, lingered by the split-rail fence. A few classmates crowded around, watching him draw with his stub of charcoal. He worked quickly with that same unnerving confidence, while the others jeered or fell silent, depending on what lines began to emerge. When the picture was finished, it revealed a riverside town, long, low warehouses with slanted roofs, a dock jutting into the current, and barges tied along the wharf. To his peers, it was little more than another of Elias's odd amusements. But to Miss Reeves and several parents present, the image had a different weight. It was too specific, too deliberate, as though copied from a surveyor's plan. At first, the adults dismissed it as invention. Breathitt folk were not strangers to the idea of far-off places. Some had served in the war 2 decades earlier and seen cities larger than anything Elias could imagine. But the drawing contained details that demanded explanation. The river bent at just such an angle that it mirrored the Kentucky River as it turned near. Clay's Ferry, 40 miles distant, far beyond the reach of a boy who had never traveled more than 5 in his life. Moreover, the sketch included stacked barrels and labeled crates, tiny scrawls that could be interpreted as numbers and initials. The precision was unlike the fanciful marks children usually produced. The matter might have ended there if not for the county surveyor, Jonathan Harkins, who happened to be in the district marking parcels, and shown the drawing by the schoolteacher. He studied it in silence before nodding with visible discomfort. He recognized the scene. It matched near perfectly a dockside trading post on the river that he himself had charted weeks earlier. The boy had drawn the warehouse doors with the correct count. The barges tied on the western bank rather than the eastern, even the slope of the riverbank, where wagons descended to meet the boats. Harkins later put his observation into writing in a letter to the county clerk, an excerpt of which survives. The rendering is of such accuracy that I cannot ascribe it to fancy. The child has, without traveling nor instruction, produced a likeness to a location known to me, 40 miles distant. That letter is preserved in the courthouse archives, an artifact as startling as the sketch itself. This revelation sent ripples through the community. Some marveled at the child's apparent gift, speaking of him as touched by providence, a vessel of vision. Others darkened their tone, muttering of witchcraft or possession. In a county where faith governed explanations, the idea that a boy could see what he should not see unsettled even the most tolerant. By the following Sunday, Elias's drawing had been mentioned from the pulpit, indirectly, but clearly enough. The preacher warned against images that deceive, urging families to keep their children close to prayer and far from temptation. The congregation understood the reference. For Elias himself, there seemed no awareness of the commotion. He did not boast nor shrink when asked where the image came from. He gave the same answer to every question. It was there in my head. So I drew it. He appeared neither troubled nor proud. But those words, delivered with such simplicity, only deepened the unease. If he was not imagining, then what was the source? If he was remembering, what was he remembering from? This incident marks the pivot where coincidence began to fade as a plausible explanation. A child's talent could account for a neat drawing of a barn, or even a fanciful riverside, but the accuracy of a distant dock, confirmed independently by a state surveyor, strained the boundaries of what could be dismissed. Innocence met undeniable precision, and in that meeting, Breathitt County began to fracture into camps of wonder and fear. The artifact, the letter from surveyor Harkins, remains one of the earliest documented acknowledgments that Elias's work was not merely unusual but inexplicably correct. It is the first piece of hard proof in a case that would only grow darker with each new drawing. The word spread quickly, as it always did in a county bound less by roads than by rumor. Within a week of the surveyor's letter, the townsfolk of Breathitt were divided in their judgment of Elias Turner. At the general store, men argued over barrels of flour and nails. One swore the boy was gifted by God, placed among them to offer warning or guidance, while another spat tobacco, juice into the dust and muttered that such knowledge came only from the devil. At the churchyard, women gathered after Sunday service, voices lowered yet urgent, asking one another if they would allow their children to sit beside him in class. Innocence and suspicion now traveled hand in hand, each feeding the other. Some neighbors were quietly proud, imagining that their remote valley might be home to a prodigy who could draw the unseen with the accuracy of a trained cartographer. They hoped his skill might draw the attention of benefactors in Lexington or Louisville, a blessing that could lift the Turners out of poverty and bring the county a measure of respect. But others were not so hopeful. They whispered that such talents never came without cost. A gift that set one child so far apart from the rest must be dangerous, and perhaps contagious, a crack in the natural order that could widen until it swallowed the whole community. The church took the matter most seriously. Reverend Isaiah Colburn, a man whose booming sermons had carried over the hills for 20 years, chose not to name Elias directly from the pulpit, but his warning was unmistakable. There are visions that come from heaven, and there are visions that come from darker wells. The devil, too, is precise in his works. Families who heard him drew their own conclusions. Some prayed harder for Elias, believing the boy must be saved before evil claimed him. Others concluded he was already lost, a vessel for forces that no prayer could redeem. Meanwhile, Miss Reeves, the school teacher, found her classroom charged with unease. Children stared at Elias with a mixture of fascination and fear. Some dared him to draw more, pressing scraps of paper into his hands, eager for spectacle. Others shrank from him, sliding their desks away as though proximity itself carried danger. Elias endured it with a strange composure, neither eager to please nor desperate to withdraw. He continued to draw whenever the impulse took him, offering no explanation, as though he himself was caught between belonging and exile. The Turner family, too, felt the strain. Elias's father grew restless, ashamed that his son was whispered about rather than respected for honest labor. He began spending longer hours at the mill, returning home in silence, his disappointment palpable. His mother, on the other hand, became even more protective. She walked him to school and back, her hand firm on his shoulder, glaring at those who looked too long or crossed themselves as they passed. It was as if she sensed that the community's judgment could tip at any moment from wary curiosity to open hostility. This was the season when letters began arriving from neighboring counties. Some inquired politely about the boy's talent. Others demanded to know if the rumors were true that he could draw the future. One unsigned note, left folded on the Turner's doorstep, contained only 6 words. Send the boy away before calamity. The contrast could not have been sharper: admiration and envy on one side, fear and rejection on the other. Elias had become a mirror for the community, reflecting both its hope for providence and its dread of witchcraft. It is important to recognize that this division was not unique to Breathitt County. The late 19th century was a time when America itself wrestled with competing explanations for the inexplicable. Science advanced steadily, promising rational answers, while faith held firm against intrusion. The boys' drawings landed squarely in that contested ground, forcing ordinary people to take sides in a debate they had no language to settle. Was Elias a prodigy, a prophet, or a curse? In the eyes of his neighbors, he was already something more than a child, and that transformation, born of both reverence and fear, would only accelerate with the next drawing to come. The second incident began with an unease that no one recognized until it was too late. In early November of 1885, Breathitt County had entered its lean season. The crops were in, the nights turned sharp with frost, and the men of the valley spent longer hours underground, in the small but dangerous coal pits that dotted the ridges. Work was brutal and often deadly. Timber props splintered, methane gas smoldered unseen, and the weight of the mountain above pressed down with a silence that never let the miners forget how fragile their safety was. Against this backdrop of constant peril, Elias produced a drawing that would be remembered as a warning unheeded, or to some, as the curse that called death down upon the valley. It was a Thursday afternoon in the schoolhouse. Miss Reeves had given the children a lesson in arithmetic, but Elias's slate remained untouched. Instead, he bent over a scrap of paper, tongue pressed to his lip in concentration. The other children whispered and nudged each other, for they knew what was coming. When he finished, he laid the drawing flat and the whispers turned into a hush. What he had made was not a map or a town, but the dark interior of a mine. The beams sagged under weight, planks split, and beneath them lay jagged lines that could only be read as fallen stone. At the center, stick-like figures were sketched prone beneath the rubble. Even crudely drawn, the meaning was unmistakable. Miss Reeves, unsettled, tried to collect the paper at once, but by then the children had already carried the tale home. By evening, half the town was repeating that the Turner boy had drawn death in the mines. Some scoffed, dismissing it as coincidence or childish imagination, but others were shaken, for many families depended on those shafts for their livelihood. And every man knew collapse was always a breath away. The drawing circulated among adults that night, passing from hand to hand like a forbidden text. Only 3 days later, on Sunday morning, the ground shuddered as timbers gave way in the Johnson Hollow pit, a mile from the Turner's cabin. 12 men were trapped inside, 3 of them crushed beyond recognition when rescuers finally pulled them to the surface. The collapse was not unusual in itself. Accidents of that kind were grimly common, but the timing in relation to Elias's drawing turned ordinary tragedy into something that felt like destiny. The coincidence was too sharp, the echo too precise. The county coroner filed his report the following week, a spare document noting fatal compression of the chest and skull, consistent with collapse. That report, preserved in brittle ink, bears a chilling resemblance to Elias's sketch. Where the coroner described timbers broken, stone dislodged, Elias had already placed lines across beams and jagged shading to mark the cave-in. Though his drawing lacked words, the correspondence between art and event was undeniable. The document and the sketch, viewed side by side, became the second artifact in a growing dossier that officials would later struggle to explain. This incident widened the divide within the community. For some, the boy's drawing was a warning, ignored until too late. Had they acted on it, closed the mine, reinforced the beams, perhaps lives might have been saved. For others, the drawing was proof of something darker, that Elias's very act of creation invited the disaster. The belief that naming misfortune brings it nearer had long roots in the hills, and now it clung to the Turner boy like smoke to cloth. Mothers crossed themselves when he passed. Fathers muttered that no child should know such things. At home, Elias was quieter than usual. When asked where the image had come from, he only shook his head. According to his mother, he sat at the hearth that night and burned the stub of charcoal until nothing remained, staring into the embers as if waiting for something to vanish with it. He did not speak of the drawing again. His silence only deepened the mystery, for it suggested not ignorance but burden, an awareness that what he had made had crossed a line between play and consequence. With the mine collapse, Breathitt County's curiosity curdled into fear. What had been dismissed as coincidence with the river dock could no longer be brushed aside. Elias's second drawing seemed to bind image and event so tightly that even skeptics faltered. The boy's innocence was now inseparable from calamity. Where some saw a prophet ignored, others saw a harbinger of death. Either way, he had ceased to be a child in the eyes of the community. He had become a figure marked, a presence that demanded explanation and scrutiny, that would soon arrive from beyond the county's borders. Dr. Samuel Merriweather arrived in Breathitt County in late November, summoned less by official decree than by the tug of professional curiosity. A physician by training, he styled himself an alienist, a term newly fashionable in the 1880s for doctors who studied disorders of the mind and perception. His reputation had grown in Louisville after publishing a paper on child prodigies of mathematical inclination, and though his peers regarded him with suspicion for straying into territory too close to folklore, the whispers from Breathitt reached him like a challenge. A child who could draw places, unseen and disasters, yet to unfold such a case promised either a career-making discovery or an embarrassment to be swiftly forgotten. He packed his leather satchel with notebooks, quills, and a brass compass, determined to see for himself. The contrast he carried into the valley was stark. Science in a county that clung fiercely to scripture. His coat was clean, his boots polished, his voice precise, all of which set him apart from the coal-dusted men who greeted him with narrowed eyes. Outsiders were rarely welcomed in Breathitt, and doctors even less so, for they were seen as meddling with matters best left to prayer. Meriwether's arrival stirred unease, but the recent mine collapse had left the community shaken enough to tolerate his presence, if only to hear whether his examination could prove the boy was ordinary after all. Elias met the doctor in the schoolhouse under Miss Reeves's watchful gaze. Small and pale, the boy looked more fragile than the rumors had suggested. He sat stiffly on the bench, hands folded in his lap, eyes darting not to the doctor, but to the paper and ink laid neatly on the table. Meriwether began with questions. Gentle at first, what did Elias dream of at night? Did he remember his drawings before he made them? Did he know where these places existed? Elias answered little. His replies were short, almost evasive, as though he had been taught that silence was safer than truth. When asked how he could draw beams splintering in a mine shaft, he whispered, "I saw it when I closed my eyes," and said no more. The doctor's notes from that session survive, preserved in his journal. The child is intelligent, though withdrawn, exhibits none of the restlessness typical of the nervous or deranged. His manner suggests compulsion. He draws not for amusement, but as though commanded by a vision. When pressed, he trembles, particularly when asked to recall the source of the images. These observations reveal Meriwether's ambivalence. On one hand, he was a man of rational training, determined to catalogue Elias's abilities as phenomena of the mind. On the other, he felt the tug of dread that had already gripped the valley. One drawing in particular occupied him. It was Elias's rendering of the riverside dock, the same that had shaken the county weeks earlier. Meriwether traced the outline of warehouses against the surveyor's chart. Each line corresponded within a margin too small to ascribe to chance. Even the curvature of the river, the alignment of a small outbuilding by the wharf, details scarcely noticed by adults who had visited in person, were preserved in miniature on the child's paper. The doctor noted in his journal, "This is no act of idle fancy. It bears the imprint of observation, yet the boy swears he has not seen it. The faculty here at play is unknown to science." He turned next to the mine sketch, the most troubling of them all. Side by side with the coroner's report, the parallels chilled him. The angle of collapsed beams, the arrangement of rubble, even the suggestion of bodies beneath, each matched the description filed days later. Meriwether considered coincidence, then precognition, then the possibility that the boy had overheard conversations about the mine's weaknesses and merely dramatized them. Yet Elias had drawn the collapse days before it occurred, and no child should have been privy to such technical detail. Rational explanations faltered at every turn. As he worked, Meriwether began recording marginalia that revealed more of himself than of his subject. "I find myself glancing to the window as though expecting a shadow to stir. My rational mind resists what the evidence insists upon. If a child may see distant or future things, then what of the rest of us? Do we walk blind while others bear sight?" His analysis became entangled with philosophy, as though the boy's drawings threatened not only science, but the very assumptions of human knowledge. He did not confine himself to private speculation. Meriwether interviewed those who had seen Elias at work, carefully noting their testimonies. Miss Reeves reported that Elias never erased, never faltered, drawing as if copying from a model unseen. Miners described his mind sketch with pale faces, saying it was the very image of the collapse. Even Elias's mother admitted reluctantly that she feared her son's drawings foretold calamity. Each account reinforced the anomaly rather than dispelled it. The contrast that consumed Meriwether's analysis was proof versus origin. He had proof enough, drawings that matched places and events. Elias could not have known. What he lacked was origin, the how that science demanded. Without it, the evidence threatened to slip into superstition, and Merriweather, proud of his profession, refused to yield to that. Yet each night, as he laid his quill aside, the unease deepened. He confessed in one entry, "I came to expose illusion, but I find myself exposed instead to the limits of reason, to the possibility that the mind may reach beyond the confines of body and place." The artifacts from this stage are among the most telling. Fragments of Merriweather's journal, preserved in the university archives where he later taught, include sketches he made of Elias's drawings beside notations of scale. The handwriting is precise, the annotations clinical, but in the margins, his script grows hurried, as if emotion pressed through the pen. The boy knows what he cannot. This knowledge wounds him. He trembles not with madness, but with the burden of sight. These lines reveal that the investigation was no longer dispassionate. It was becoming personal, a test not only of Elias's strange faculty, but of Merriweather's faith in the boundaries of science itself. By the end of his first fortnight in Breathitt, the doctor was no longer merely an observer. He was a man caught between conviction and doubt, convinced of the boy's accuracy yet powerless to explain it. His analysis had confirmed the anomaly, but confirmation only sharpened the dread. Proof, it seemed, was not liberation but a snare. It forced him to admit what he most feared, that some truths arrive whole and unbidden, and that the structures of reason may collapse before them as surely as the timbers of a mine. The morning Elias sketched the penitentiary farm began like any other, yet by its end the county's fragile patience would teeter toward collapse. Dr. Merriweather had returned for another session at the schoolhouse, determined to press the boy further. His method was simple: provide blank paper, record what emerged, compare later with known structures. He approached it with clinical discipline, but on that particular day, Elias's hands shook with unusual violence before pencil even touched the page. Miss Reeves noted in her own diary, still held in a private family collection, that the boy seemed pale, fevered, as though some weight unseen pressed upon him. When the drawing began to take form, the silence in the room grew taut. Elias outlined a long, low building with barred windows, then fields marked by rows of fencing and guardposts. Slowly he added figures, small human shapes with shackled limbs, their bodies bent against burdens. Beside them he drew a tall stone wall, crudely shaded but unmistakable, topped with spiked gates. Merriweather recognized it instantly, the penitentiary farm in Frankfort, more than 100 miles away, known throughout Kentucky as both punishment and labor camp. Elias had never left Breathitt County, yet here was the prison rendered with chilling fidelity. The accuracy unsettled Merriweather, but what followed was worse. Elias began shading a portion of the wall until the paper grew dark, the marks fierce and smudged. He pressed harder, breaking the pencil tip, then whispered that the wall would fall. When the doctor asked what he meant, the boy buried his face in his hands, refusing to continue. The unfinished drawing lay on the desk. Half prison, half ruin, its meaning too stark to ignore. Merriweather's analysis came swiftly. Recorded in his journal, the penitentiary farm is not within his experience, nor could any description he overheard yield this precision. That he depicts collapse suggests not mere memory, but foresight. I'm shaken. If this proves true, calamity awaits men whose lives are already marked by suffering. He was careful to preserve the sketch, folding it into his satchel as evidence. This artifact would later resurface in the archives of the State Historical Society, its edges brittle, but the blackened wall still visible, haunting in its suggestion of impending disaster. The community's reaction, however, was less restrained. Word of the prison drawing spread through the valley almost at once, carried by whispers from pupils who had seen it, and from Miss Reeves's anxious glance at neighbors. Some took it as confirmation that Elias trafficked with powers unholy. Why else would a child, never traveled beyond the ridges of Breathitt, depict with such clarity the place where convicts toiled under the whip? Others saw it as evidence of curse, that if he foresaw collapse, then his very sight might call disaster into being. By evening, men gathered in tense clusters outside the general store, voices low but sharp. They argued whether to petition the sheriff to act, to silence the child before greater ruin befell them. For them, the contrast was unbearable, sanctuary versus damnation. A schoolhouse, meant to be a place of learning and innocence, had become a stage for drawings of prisons and disasters. To allow it to continue seemed reckless. To intervene risked challenging forces they scarcely dared name. Merriweather, for his part, resisted the fever of superstition. Yet in private his resolve wavered. He could no longer dismiss the evidence as coincidence or skill. Too many lines aligned, too many predictions hinted at disaster. In one margin note he admitted, "The boy has drawn a place no one in this county could conjure unaided. My science falters. I begin to question whether knowledge may arrive unbidden, not through learning, but through some aperture we do not comprehend." His pen strokes grew uneven there, betraying the tremor of his own hand. This moment, the penitentiary sketch, marked the second great incident, one that escalated suspicion from curiosity to fear. Elias was no longer merely the strange child who saw mines and rivers. He was now the boy who drew prisons crumbling, who foretold ruin beyond the valley itself. Breathett's mystery had become Kentucky's burden, and the question of what to do with him could no longer be deferred. The days following the penitentiary drawing were marked by a rising tide of unrest that no sermon nor sheriff's patrol could calm. Breathitt County, already burdened by poverty and superstition, now found itself the keeper of a child whose visions seemed to stretch beyond its borders. What had begun as whispers after a mine collapse had hardened into conviction. Elias Turner's drawings were no longer harmless curiosities, but dangerous portents. The sketch of the penitentiary wall, falling, folded in. Dr. Merriweather's satchel spread through the valley in description, if not in sight, and descriptions were enough to ignite dread. Community leaders convened in the back room of the county courthouse, a space more often used for land disputes and cattle theft hearings. There, under the flickering lamplight, the local magistrate, the sheriff, 2 elders from the Baptist congregation, and the school board chair sat in uneasy council. They debated not whether Elias's abilities were real, but whether they were tolerable. The magistrate, a man devoted to order, warned that if word reached Frankfort that a Breathitt boy had predicted collapse at the penitentiary farm, outsiders would descend upon them, bringing ridicule and scrutiny. The elders spoke of spiritual peril, arguing that visions of ruin were signs of Satan's work, not divine gift. And the school board chair, weary of growing complaints, insisted the boy could longer remain in the classroom, without endangering the other children. The sheriff alone counseled caution, though not out of sympathy. He feared that rash action, be it banishment, confinement, or worse, would spark rumors of persecution. Breathitt had already earned a reputation for lawlessness in the state papers, and another scandal would only deepen its shame. His words slowed the fervor but did not quench it. The council adjourned without resolution, leaving in its wake a heavy silence that promised action of some kind would soon follow. Meanwhile, Merriweather pressed on with his examination. Though he sensed the ground shifting beneath him, his role as investigator placed him at odds with the community's rising hostility. He carried himself with professional detachment, yet privately admitted the strain. "The boy is more prisoner than patient," he wrote in his journal, confined by suspicion thicker than iron bars. His efforts to frame Elias as a subject of study, not superstition, clashed with neighbors who wanted the matter settled through prayer, punishment, or removal. Science against fear. Each day it seemed the latter held stronger ground. The tension reached its sharpest point one evening when Merriweather, while leaving the schoolhouse, found a slip of folded paper nailed to the door. Inside was no official notice, but a crude warning: "Take your boy and go, before he brings ruin on us all." The doctor recognized the hand of fear. Not malice, but the message was plain. His inquiry was no longer welcome. He copied the note into his journal, labeling it artifact of hysteria, but beneath the clinical description one reads the trace of unease. His ink pressed harder. The words shorter clipped. Elias, though shielded as best as Miss Reeves and his mother could manage, felt the shift in atmosphere. Children avoided him at recess. Adults watched him with wary eyes when he passed. He grew more withdrawn, reluctant even to touch paper. When Merriweather encouraged him, he resisted, whispering that they don't want to see any more. The boy's fear and the valley's suspicion were mirrors of one another, feeding a cycle that neither could break. It was at this juncture that officials from outside the county began to take notice. Reports of the penitentiary sketch had traveled by word of mouth to Frankfurt, and though dismissed by many as hill country superstition, a few in positions of influence found curiosity piqued. A boy who foresaw disaster, who drew state institutions crumbling. If such claims bore even a fragment of truth, it demanded investigation or suppression. Letters were sent quietly to the county clerk, inquiring about Elias Turner. No official action had yet been taken, but the weight of authority was moving closer. Snow fell thin and wet across Breathitt County the morning the letter arrived, its seal carrying the imprint of the Commonwealth. The county clerk, a man more accustomed to filing deeds and livestock tallies, turned pale as he broke it open. The message was brief, written in a bureaucrat's neat hand. An investigator from Frankfurt would soon travel east to inquire about the case of Elias Turner, a minor of peculiar faculty, subject of reports concerning the penitentiary farm. It was not a request, but an announcement, and within days the entire valley knew. The prospect of outsiders, state men, educated and armed with authority, set the community on edge. For some it promised relief. At last, Elias would be taken away, his unsettling visions no longer their burden. For others, it threatened exposure. To admit the boys' drawings had predicted disaster was to admit their complicity in hiding him. Fear of ridicule in the press and scrutiny from officials gnawed at both leaders and townsfolk. Either outcome, confirmation or dismissal, promised shame. Dr. Merriweather was summoned first, as he was already regarded by locals as the boy's custodian. He received a formal notice instructing him to present his findings when the investigator arrived. In his journal, the entry is uncharacteristically terse. The Commonwealth takes notice. My observations may serve either as shield or as blade. I must decide where my loyalty lies, to science, to the boy or to the state. His once clinical pursuit of knowledge had become entangled with ethics, forcing him into a role he had not anticipated. Proof versus protection. The contrast now defined his every thought. Elias himself seemed to sense the coming intrusion. Miss Reeves recorded in her diary that the boy became restless, pacing the classroom, refusing even to glance at paper. One afternoon he muttered that men were coming to take him to the stone walls he drew. Whether he meant the penitentiary or some other vision, no one could tell, but the words chilled those who heard them. The burden of foresight appeared to be folding back upon him, crushing the fragile distinction between what he imagined, what he feared, and what might yet come. The townsfolk split into factions. A small circle of parents argued for protecting Elias, insisting he was only a child and deserved care, not interrogation. But their voices were drowned by louder demands, elders warning of God's wrath if such unholy sight is coddled, miners recalling the collapse and muttering that his drawing had sealed their fate. The sheriff, caught between, urged calm, but prepared his deputies in case order faltered. What had been suspicion was becoming crisis. Artifacts from this moment survive in scattered form. A copy of the state letter remains in the county archives, its ink faded but legible. On the back, in the clerk's hurried scrawl, are the words, "Heard folks whisper walls will fall. Lord help us." Another fragment, a page torn from Miss Reeves's journal. Notes, the boy is not wicked. He is weary. Yet men speak of him as though he were already condemned. These documents serve as counterpoints, official authority pressing in, private compassion trying to hold ground. By late December, word arrived that the state, man identified only as Mr. Alden in subsequent records, would arrive within the week. His reputation preceded him, a civil servant of the prison board, known for his rigid manner and disdain for folk nonsense. The valley braced itself, some with relief, others with dread. Breathitt's secret was about to be dragged into the light, and there was no consensus on whether that light would expose truth or consume them all. The arrival of Mr. Jonathan Alden was not dramatic in appearance, but in consequence it marked the turning of the knife. He stepped off the coach in Jackson on the first week of January, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a coat too fine for the muddy street. His boots were polished despite the road, his satchel heavy with ledgers, and his eyes carried the fixed hardness of a man who believed in the weight of paper more than people. He introduced himself at once to the sheriff, producing a letter of commission from the state prison board. Though he spoke politely, his tone made it clear he had come not to listen, but to resolve. The sheriff, uneasy but deferential, led him first to the courthouse. There, in a room more used to small-town disputes, Alden spread his papers across the table, arranging them like exhibits in a trial. He asked for the boys' drawings, for testimony from the schoolteacher, for records of the mine collapse. His language was clinical, but his intent plain. He wanted the anomalies catalogued and judged, not cherished as mysteries. "We are not in the business of folklore," he said, according to one witness. "We are in the business of keeping order. If this boy's sketches spread panic, then his hand must be restrained." Merriweather, called to attend, bristled at the man's tone. He laid before Alden several of Elias's surviving sketches, including the penitentiary drawing with its darkened wall. He offered his notes, his careful comparisons to maps and reports. But his voice betrayed a hesitation foreign to his earlier confidence. He was no longer certain whether presenting evidence would protect Elias or condemn him. Proof was double-edged. It could establish Elias's rare gift, but in Alden's eyes it might equally establish guilt, or at least danger. The interrogation of witnesses followed, beginning with Miss Reeves. She spoke gently but firmly, emphasizing Elias's innocence, his reluctance, his fear of what he drew. "He does not seek attention," she testified. "If anything, he dreads it. The drawings come to him as burden, not boast." Alden listened, but his pencil scratched across the page without pause, reducing her compassion to sterile lines of testimony. Next came miners who had seen the collapse sketch. Their voices shook as they described the uncanny resemblance. Alden pressed them, asking whether Elias had overheard talk of the mine's weakness. They denied it, but their unease made them unreliable witnesses in his eyes. When Elias himself was brought into the room, the air seemed to thicken. The boy sat small in the chair, his boots barely brushing the floor. Alden leaned forward, his questions sharp and unyielding. "Where did you see the prison? Who told you the wall would fall? Do you intend these drawings to frighten honest men?" Elias answered little, whispering that he just saw it. When pressed, he fell silent, tears sliding down his face. Merriweather's journal records the moment with sorrow. It was not examination but prosecution. The child was accused of his own sight, as though vision were crime. Artifacts from the hearing survive in fragmented form. The clerk's minutes, still preserved in the county archives. Note simply, the boy did not deny. He did not affirm. He only wept. Merriweather's private notes capture more. Sketches of Alden's stern face opposite. Elias's hunched frame, the margin filled with a single phrase. Power against powerlessness. This contrast lay at the heart of the session. A state official wielding authority like a blade, and a child who could neither defend himself nor explain the source of his burden. By the day's end, Alden had reached a conclusion. Though he did not yet speak it aloud, the boy, he believed, represented a risk. Whether charlatan or prodigy mattered little. What mattered was the possibility of unrest, of rumor reaching. Frankfurt that convicts might riot if whispers of the wall's collapse spread. For the prison board, stability outweighed truth. Alden's eyes betrayed no wonder, only calculation. As he packed his satchel, the valley seemed to exhale in dread. Something had shifted. Elias was no longer only a child under suspicion of his neighbors. He was now a subject of the state, weighed and found troubling. The contrast tightened like a noose, community fear merging with institutional power, both converging on a boy who had never asked to see beyond his own valley. The next steps would not be gentle, and those who cared for Elias knew it. Mr. Alden wasted little time in shaping his judgment into words. The morning after the questioning, he requested a private session with the magistrate, the sheriff, and the elders of the Baptist congregation. They gathered again in the courthouse, shutters drawn against the pale January light, as though secrecy might soften the weight of what was about to be spoken. Alden laid a single sheet of paper upon the table. Its language was stripped of sentiment. Recommendation: removal of minor Elias Turner from Breathitt County to custody of the Commonwealth for observation and restraint. The phrase observation and restraint hung in the air like a verdict. To the elders, it was proof that the boy's sight was unholy, dangerous, requiring separation from the innocent. To the magistrate, it promised relief from scandal. If Elias were gone, the county could deny further responsibility. Even the sheriff, who had hesitated at harsher measures, admitted that resisting the state's will would bring trouble no small town could afford. The consensus hardened swiftly. Elias would be taken. News of this decision spread by whispers long before it reached Elias himself. Mothers pulled their children closer, muttering prayers. Minors exchanged uneasy glances, torn between guilt for having testified and relief that the burden would be lifted. Only Miss Reeves dared speak openly against it. She told neighbors that sending Elias away would not protect them, that his drawings were cries for help, not curses. But compassion sounded feeble against the grinding weight of official decree. Merriweather found himself cornered in both conscience and profession. In his journal he scrawled, "I came as examiner, I remain as witness. The boy is condemned not for what he has done, but for what he might reveal. Truth is punished as though it were treachery." He understood what observation and restraint meant. It was not a promise of study in the safety of a university. It was confinement, likely at the very penitentiary Elias had drawn. The irony was unbearable. His vision of falling walls might prove not a prophecy, but a cruel inversion of his own fate. The boy himself learned of the decision in fragments. Miss Reeves, unwilling to let him hear it first from strangers, told him gently that men from Frankfurt wished to take him to a place where he would be safe. Elias shook his head, whispering that he had already seen the walls. "They will close," he said, "and no one will—" "Let me out," his words unsettled her so deeply that she later wrote in her diary, "The child's fear was not of leaving home, but of fulfilling what he had drawn." It was as though he knew the line between paper and world was already gone. An artifact from this period survives in the form of a draft petition, unsigned but preserved among county papers. It reads, "We, the undersigned, request that the boy be removed for the peace of this community, for his drawings have caused unrest and danger. The paper is stained, edges torn, but its bluntness remains chilling." Here was fear made official, superstition translated into administrative language. The contrast could not be sharper. A frail child with sketches versus the machinery of the state, armed with ink and law. For the valley, the recommendation promised closure. For Elias, it promised captivity. Merriweather, increasingly desperate, weighed his options. He considered appealing to colleagues in Louisville, men of learning who might defend Elias as a medical curiosity. But time was short, and he knew Alden's word carried weight that few would contest. He wrote in one hurried note, "If they take him, he will vanish into walls. His drawings will vanish with him, and the question will remain unanswered, unasked, unallowed." Snow lingered in grey crusts along the ridges when preparations for Elias's removal began in earnest. The sheriff received Alden's formal order, signed and sealed with the Commonwealth's crest, directing him to escort the boy to Frankfurt within the week. To outward appearances, the task was simple: gather a wagon, post 2 deputies, deliver the child into state custody. Yet beneath that plain directive throbbed a tangle of resistance, unease, and whispered dissent. Breathitt County might have agreed to let the state claim Elias, but not every heart in the valley was willing to see it done. Meriwether, more conflicted with each passing day, became Elias's unlikely guardian. He tried to keep the boy close, accompanying him during lessons, walking him home in the evenings. In his journal he wrote, "I sense the approach of a final parting." His silence deepens. He will not touch paper. When asked if he will draw again, he replies only, "Not here. I feel a weight upon me." The knowledge that once he is gone, all inquiry ends. He will not be studied, he will be hidden. The doctor's clinical detachment had long since given way to a kind of desperate loyalty. Miss Reeves, too, quietly prepared her own resistance. Though outwardly she complied with the authorities, in private she confided to Elias's mother her belief that the boy would not survive. Long inside stone walls, together they whispered of alternatives, sending Elias away with distant kin, or hiding him in the hollows until Alden departed. But every plan faltered against the county's watchful eyes. Neighbors were quick to notice unusual movements, and suspicion lay heavy in every glance. The boy himself grew quieter still, as though retreating into some private world beyond reach. On the night his removal papers were finalized, he took a scrap of paper against his own recent refusals and sketched a small image by candlelight. It showed a wagon rolling down a road, 2 men seated at its front, and himself in the back, small and hunched. But in the distance he had drawn not Frankfurt's penitentiary, but a dark forest. Trees pressing close around the wagon's path. Beneath the sketch he scrawled a single line, "The woods will not let us through." When Meriwether saw it the next day, his unease deepened into dread. Artifacts from this period reveal the rising tension. In the county archives survives a copy of the sheriff's order for transport, dated January 17, 1886, one Elias Turner, minor, to be conveyed under guard to the custody of the Board of Prisons for the purposes of observation and restraint, in compliance with recommendation of Mr. J. Alden, pinned. Beside it in the same folder is a fragment of Miss Reeves's journal. "He will be taken, but I cannot help believing his sight shows more than any of us can see. If the woods hold him, perhaps it is mercy." These paired documents capture the clash between law's certainty and private doubt. As the date of removal approached, the valley itself seemed unsettled. Dogs barked at night without cause. Families whispered of seeing Elias's pale figure in their dreams, standing wordless by their beds. The miners spoke of new creaks and groans in the shafts, muttering that another collapse was near. Fear took many shapes, but all pointed back to the boy, as though his very presence bent the air around him. The morning of departure dawned brittle and pale, the frost tracing white veins along every fence post and window pane. The sheriff's wagon stood ready in the square, its wheels newly greased, 2 mules stamping the frozen ground. A few townsfolk gathered at a distance, pretending to busy themselves with errands, yet unable to look away. The hush was funereal. No one called it such, but the air carried the same weight as a burial procession. Elias emerged from his mother's small home, flanked by the sheriff and a deputy. His clothes were plain, woolen shirt, patched trousers, boots too large for his feet, yet he looked older somehow. His expression drained of childish softness. Miss Reeves walked beside him, her face tight with unspoken fury. Meriwether followed behind, notebook tucked beneath his coat, documenting what he knew might be his final moments of witness. "This is not removal," he muttered under his breath. "It is exile." When Elias was lifted into the back of the wagon, he made no struggle. He simply sat, shoulders hunched, hands clasped together as if in prayer. The sheriff cleared his throat and gave the order to move. The wheels creaked forward, cutting lines in the frost. The crowd remained silent, some with hats in hand, others turning away as though ashamed to look. One old woman crossed herself, whispering, "God forgive us." The road out of Jackson wound through a corridor of leafless trees, branches black against the gray sky. For an hour the wagon rolled on without incident. Elias stared toward the forest with an intensity that unsettled even the hardened deputy. Meriwether rode on horseback just behind. Unable to rid himself of the boy's final drawing, the wagon bound for woods, swallowed by darkness. Midway along a narrow stretch where the road pinched between steep rises, the mules balked, their ears pinned back, hooves scraping. They refused to move forward. The sheriff cursed and snapped the reins, but the animals only reared and snorted. Elias lifted his head, speaking softly for the first time that day. "They see what you do not." The deputy shivered, swore under his breath, and climbed down to push. Still the mules resisted. From the ridge above came the faint crack of a branch. Then another. The sheriff's hand went to his pistol. Meriwether turned sharply, scanning the tree line. Figures appeared, stepping from the woods with deliberate calm. They were miners, men. Elias had once drawn upon scraps of paper with their tools and lamps. Faces grim, coats ragged, eyes hard. They carried no firearms, only axes and heavy timbers, as if pulled directly from the shaft. "Let the boy be," one called, his voice raw with dust and long shifts underground. "He's no prisoner." The sheriff bristled, hand tightening on his weapon, but he hesitated. Outnumbered, outflanked. He knew violence here could ignite a battle the town would not forgive. Meriwether spurred his horse forward, interceding with raised hands. "Gentlemen, listen. This course is lawful, though misguided. Do not turn protection into bloodshed." The miners advanced slowly, their boots crunching frost. One set down his axe at the road's edge and reached a hand toward. "Elias, come with us, son," he said. Elias looked from the sheriff to the miners, then to Meriwether. His lips trembled as he whispered, "The drawing is true." The woods stopped the wagon. Artifacts from this episode remain elusive, but two accounts survive. One is Meriwether's hurried note penned later that evening. The boy was not freed by force, but by paralysis of will. The law would not fire, the miners would not yield, and in the center sat a child who seemed already to have seen it all. The other is an unsigned report sent to Frankfurt stating only transport delayed, resistance encountered, further instructions requested. The vagueness betrays the truth. No authority wished to admit that a handful of miners had halted the state's command. The standoff in the woods stretched into a silence so taut it seemed the trees themselves were listening. Frosted branches loomed over the road, their dark limbs forming an arch like the ribs of some vast beast. The sheriff, his hand hovering near the butt of his pistol, measured the distance between himself and the nearest miner. The deputy, pale and sweating, shifted nervously, glancing at Elias as though the boy were the source of the cold air that thickened around them. The miners stood firm. They had the look of men who had endured too much danger underground to be frightened by a badge or a drawn gun. Their leader, a gaunt fellow named Rourke, carried a timber beam across his shoulder like a weapon, but spoke with measured calm. "This child has seen what we've seen. His drawings showed the shaft falling before it fell. You would cage him like a criminal for telling the truth? Not while we stand." Meriwether dismounted and placed himself between the sheriff and the miners, his voice shaking more with urgency than fear. "Gentlemen, understand, these men act under the Commonwealth seal. To oppose them is to brand yourselves as lawless. Yet I say plainly, the boy deserves study, not imprisonment. Surely there is some course between abandonment and rebellion." His words fell into the frosted air like fragile glass, threatening to shatter under the weight of suspicion. Elias sat motionless in the wagon, hands folded tightly. His gaze was distant yet intent, fixed on the shadowed trees as though he were reading them like the pages of a book. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin but steady. "The walls wait for me, but they will not stand long. You think you choose, but it is already drawn." His cryptic words unsettled all sides. The sheriff shifted uneasily. The deputy muttered a curse, and even the miners faltered, glancing at one another. Artifacts from this encounter are scarce, yet a fragment of Miss Reeves's later testimony survives in her correspondence. "When I heard from neighbors what passed on the road that day, I wept for the boy and for us all." The sheriff feared his duty. The miners feared their conscience, and Dr. Meriwether feared only the truth. The child alone did not tremble. It was as if the forest itself hushed to hear him. Negotiation began in halting exchanges. The sheriff demanded the miners disperse, invoking the authority of Frankfort. Rourke replied that Breathitt's mines had already buried too many, and that Elias's gift, however strange, was the only warning they had left. Meriwether pleaded for delay, suggesting Elias be examined in Louisville rather than sent directly to the penitentiary. The miners seized upon this, pressing that compromise might save both the boy and the county's pride. But Alden's name surfaced like a blade in the conversation. The sheriff muttered that the inspector would tolerate no delay, no compromise. Alden had promised the magistrate that Frankfort awaited, and Alden's word carried weight beyond the valley. At that, the miners stiffened again, for many believed Alden's presence itself had brought ruinous omens. Rumors spread that his examinations had cursed more than they healed. Elias, silent once more, closed his eyes as if shutting out the argument altogether. The tension stretched until even the mules trembled, refusing to move forward or back. At last, Meriwether raised both arms and declared, "If no peace is struck here, we will all be buried under the same earth that has already claimed so many. Let the boy remain under my custody for 7 days. If no calamity arises, then we decide anew. If one does, then perhaps you will see that his warnings are a crime," the miners murmured, among themselves, uncertain yet hopeful. The sheriff scowled, torn between his orders and the doctor's plea. For 7 days the valley lived in uneasy suspension, as though the very air waited for a verdict. Elias remained under Meriwether's care, sheltered in a spare room above the physician's office. The boy spoke little, ate sparingly, and kept his gaze fixed often on the frost-laced window, where the courthouse roof and distant hills carved hard lines against the sky. He did not draw, not once, and that absence gnawed at Meriwether more than any prophecy. "It is silence now that condemns us," he noted in his journal, "for even a warning unheeded is less cruel than the absence of one." The miners, who had defied the sheriff, held watch in shifts near the town's edge. Their resolve made them heroes in some households, reckless fools in others. Miss Reeves brought Elias bread and broth, whispering comfort, though her eyes betrayed dread. "They will come back," she told Meriwether one evening, her voice low. "The state does not forget. Alden does not forgive. We have bought days, nothing more." Meriwether could not deny it. Each night he checked the road from Frankfort, waiting for the sound of hooves. On the 5th day, a letter arrived under seal. It bore no polite delay, no compromise. "You will deliver Elias Turner into custody within 48 hours, it read, "or face consequences of obstruction. The board will not tolerate interference in matters of public safety." At the bottom, Alden's signature, curved like a flourish of iron. The sheriff delivered the message himself, his face ashen, his voice low. "They are sending men, Doctor. Armed men. I cannot stand against them, nor will your miners hold when the rifles come." Artifacts preserve this turning point with chilling clarity. The county archive holds Alden's terse correspondence, alongside Meriwether's desperate reply. "Never sent. You speak of safety, yet you build prisons for children whose only crime is truth. Is there no mercy left in your science?" The letter, unsent and unsentimental, remains folded in Meriwether's journal, blotches of ink marking where his hand had trembled. On the 7th morning, hoofbeats did come. A detachment of state guards rode into Jackson, their uniforms stiff, their rifles slung. At their head was Alden himself, his expression set in stone, his eyes glinting, with the cold determination of a man who believed the law not merely a duty but a creed. The townsfolk gathered again in uneasy clusters, recalling the aborted removal with whispers. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fearing both sides of the struggle, the strange child who drew disasters, and the state that demanded him in silence. Meriwether met Alden in the courthouse, their words sharp, stripped of civility. "You will destroy him," Meriwether said. Alden replied, "I will contain him. That is my charge." The contrast between them was total compassion versus calculation, witness versus functionary. Miss Reeves tried to speak. But Alden cut her off with the authority of one who did not regard women as rightful voices in such matters. His decree was final. Elias would be taken that very day, with or without consent. Elias, when told, only nodded. "The walls are close now," he murmured. "I hear them." His mother wept silently, unable to protest against men in uniform. The miners, outnumbered and outgunned, stood back with clenched fists but lowered heads. Resistance had given way to inevitability. The fragile truce had shattered under the iron tread of the state. The journey to Frankfurt was carried out with the precision of a military operation. No miners blocked the road this time. No neighbors whispered objections as the wagon rattled past their porches. The presence of state guards, rifles glinting in the pale winter sun, suffocated any thought of resistance. Elias sat in the back once more, hands folded in his lap, his expression strangely serene. To Meriwether, who followed on horseback though not permitted to speak with him, that serenity was more frightening than any struggle. "He goes as one who knows the end," the doctor scribbled in his notebook. Not resisting, not pleading, only waiting. Frankfurt loomed grey and imposing, its river swollen with winter melt, its penitentiary walls rising like a jagged crown above the town, constructed of stone so dark it absorbed the light. The prison looked less like a building than a cliffside hacked into grim geometry. Within those walls, the state kept its thieves, its killers, and now a child whose only crime was to see too far. Alden walked with pride at the head of the procession, as though delivering Elias were a triumph of order over chaos. Admission records from the penitentiary still survive. Brittle pages in looping script. Turner, Elias, male, minor, cause, observation. Condition, sound. The cold brevity erases everything. His drawings, his warnings, his humanity. Yet tucked in the same ledger is an annotation in a different hand. Nearly crossed out, but still legible. Unsettled. Boy speaks of walls of collapse. Eyes fixed upon stone. That single line betrays that not all who saw him could deny his strangeness. Inside the institution, Elias was not placed among the hardened criminals. Instead, he was kept in a small cell near the infirmary, under Alden's strict oversight. The room had a narrow cot, a barred window, and nothing else. Paper and pencil were denied him. Alden feared new drawings might incite unrest among staff. "No more visions," he told the wardens. "No more superstition." Yet denial could not erase the boy's sight. Elias began to trace lines with his finger on the stone walls. Invisible paths only he could see. Guards reported that at night he whispered to the mortar, telling it that soon it would crumble. Meriwether, having followed to Frankfurt under the guise of professional observation, gained brief access to Elias once. The meeting was short, supervised, and tense. The boy did not greet him. Instead, Elias whispered, "The stone listens. It does not want me here." Meriwether begged Alden for clemency, for transfer to a hospital rather than a prison, but Alden's reply was clipped. "He is safer here than anywhere else. And so are we." Miss Reeves's letters from this time reveal her anguish. "I pray for Elias every night, though my prayers seem to turn back upon me like unanswered echoes. They have locked a child in darkness, believing it will silence his gift. I fear it will only sharpen it." The contrast was unbearable. The state, believing itself victorious, had caged the boy. Those who cared for him, silenced and distant, could do nothing but wait for what he would see next. And Elias did see. On the third night, a guard reported finding him crouched by the wall, his fingertip bleeding where he had scraped it raw against the stone. On the surface of the block, faint lines had appeared, traced in blood. They formed a lattice of arches and pillars, collapsing inward. The guard, shaken, claimed it looked like the penitentiary itself, its towers breaking, its walls falling in on those within. Alden dismissed the report as hysteria. "Do not indulge the child's fancies," he ordered. Yet the sketch remained, dark against the grey stone, as though the walls themselves had begun to draw. The penitentiary's stone walls had stood for decades, weathering floods and winters. But within weeks of Elias's confinement, something began to change. The guards whispered first, small things dismissed as coincidence. A hairline crack appeared above the infirmary archway, though no frost heave should have touched that interior stone. A lantern left burning sputtered out each night at the same hour, regardless of the oil level. Prisoners reported dreams of falling masonry, screams swallowed by rubble. None dared speak loudly of these things, yet all eyes turned toward the cell of the boy, who pressed his bloody fingers against the wall. Elias had grown thinner, his cheeks hollow, but his gaze was sharper, as if the deprivation of food and freedom had only honed his sight. He no longer spoke in full sentences, only fragments murmured at night. The arches bend, the stone breathes. The tide roof does not wish to stay, guards rotated quickly, each unwilling to endure the uncanny mutterings for long. Alden dismissed their reports as weakness. The mind bends under fear, he told them. Do your duty. The walls will hold. Yet even his voice carried a brittle edge. A flicker of doubt he refused to name. Meriwether, permitted only limited visits, wrote feverishly in his journal. I cannot ignore what I see. The boy's warnings take shape in stone. Cracks spread like veins across mortar. To deny him now is not science, it is superstition dressed in authority. Alden fears appearing foolish. More than he fears collapse, his words would never be published in his lifetime. The journal would remain hidden, a sealed testimony of conscience. An artifact survives from this period in the penitentiary's maintenance log. March 2, hairline fractures observed in East Wing, reinforced with mortar. No cause apparent. The terse note reads like routine, yet beside it is a later edition, scrawled in another hand, coincides with Turner's agitation. Coincides with drawings. The annotation was nearly scratched out, as though someone feared leaving evidence of belief. On the 12th night of Elias's confinement, a tremor shook the building. Stones shifted audibly, dust raining into corridors. Prisoners screamed, guards shouted orders, and for a moment the institution teetered on the brink of chaos. In the infirmary cell, Elias sat calmly on his cot, eyes fixed on the ceiling. When asked later what he saw, one guard claimed the boy whispered, "It falls soon." Not today, but soon. That guard resigned the next morning, leaving his post without explanation. Alden refused to bend. He issued strict orders. Elias was to remain confined, his cell stripped bare, no paper or tools allowed. He feeds on attention, Alden insisted. Ignore him and he will fade. But the opposite proved true. The more the boy was silenced, the louder the walls themselves seemed to speak. For the people of Breathitt County, far removed from the penitentiary, news came only in fragments, rumors of unrest. Letters from guards too rattled to keep silence. Hints that the strange child had not vanished quietly into stone but was unraveling the very foundation that held him. Miss Reeves, upon hearing such whispers, recorded in her diary, "I feared they would bury him in silence. Now I fear silence itself will bury them."